Today I'm going to be talking about Countdown to Final Crisis Volume 2. Now, admittedly, this is a bit of an odd comic to just jump into randomly because it's part of the convoluted continuity of the mid-2000s, which I think started with Identity Crisis and then went to Infinite Crisis and then 52 and then Countdown to Final Crisis and Death of the New Gods and then Final Crisis, etc. And so there's a long series of events leading into this and also leading out of this, because this is the countdown to Final Crisis. And this isn't even the first volume of Countdown. This is volume 2. So, even if I wanted to start with Countdown, I should start with volume 1. But I was looking for a new comic to read. I was at my library browsing the shelves. I saw this randomly on the shelves. There was a limited selection that was currently on the shelf without special ordering stuff through interlibrary loan. So this was the only volume of that convoluted continuity from the mid-2000s that was on the shelves. And I thought, yeah, I'll just pick it up, see if it's interesting. In my younger days, I wouldn't have done this. I would have said, no, you have to start at the beginning or the reading experience is going to be spoiled. But now that I'm older, my new philosophy is if something looks interesting, just pick it up. And if you want to read the whole series in order, you can always do that later, and then you can reread this. So this is me just jumping into the middle of an ongoing series here to just give some thoughts. And if it wasn't already clear enough, the caveat is I don't really know what I'm talking about here. I'm just jumping into the middle of the series. But either you can leave now or stick around and help me out in the comments to tell me what I missed or what I overlooked. So my own background with comic books is I was actively reading and collecting comics in the mid-early 90s, 93, 94, 95, around then. And then I stopped buying comics, at least buying them new, but got into it a little bit again in the mid-2000s, mostly via the internet, because at this point the internet was coming into its own and there were a lot of people discussing the DC Comics continuity. In particular, I remember around this time blogs like Occasional Superheroine or YouTube channels like Atop the Fourth Wall with Linkara talking about this. It's scary how fast time goes by, but I guess that was almost 20 years ago now, right? 2025 now. This came out in 2007. It doesn't seem like it's been that long, but I guess it was some time ago. So I never read this comic, but I did follow some of the internet chatter about this comic when it was coming out. And I had mostly forgotten about it, but then reading through this and seeing these characters and these storylines, I started to think, yes, I remember when everyone was upset about this. I remember when everyone was complaining about this. So it did come back to me a little bit as I read this, what I remembered the criticisms from the internet as being. But let me back up a step and set this in the context of DC continuity as well as I can, with the disclaimers I already made that I wasn't actively reading comics at the time that this came out. But in 1986, DC had a multiverse. Not all of its heroes were in the same universe. They had different universes for different heroes. They did have a main one, but they also had non-main ones, different universes for some of its heroes. And then in 1986, they had Crisis on Infinite Earths, which merged all the universes into one and at the same time just wiped out essentially all the continuity that had existed before then, kind of. Fans were really upset about it because it was decades of continuity just erased, and comic book fans love their continuity. But DC said it was necessary to simplify their universe, and it was also a big crossover event that sold lots of comics, and because it sold lots of comics, I guess it was guaranteeing that there would be future big events. The next one was 10 years later, which was Zero Hour, which was another one which sort of reset continuity. Again, DC said that it needed to do that because there were a few lingering continuity problems from the original Crisis on Infinite Earths. And then 10 years after that, 2006, there was Infinite Crisis, which also was a big event which reset continuity. And, again, fans were a little bit upset about it, but it was becoming apparent at this time that it was DC editorial policy to just reset continuity every 10 years. That cleared up some problems with them, as continuity problems always accumulated over 10 years. It also solved the problem of what to do with characters aging. I mean, how is it that Batman is only 30 when the character has been around since the 1940s, etc.? So every 10 years, you just reset the timeline, then you don't have to worry about the characters aging or not aging over time. Then after Infinite Crisis, there was 52. And both Infinite Crisis and 52, I had novelizations of them, which I read the novelizations and reviewed them on this channel. I'll try to link to them in the description down below. And then there was Final Crisis a couple years later. Now, at this point, I think my reaction and the reaction of a lot of comic books fans was just exhaustion. Like, okay, every 10 years was one thing, but now we're going through and we're resetting it again just 2 years after. But, and that sense of exhaustion, I think, maybe played into some of the negative reviews that Countdown got. And Countdown was the series leading into Final Crisis. So each issue was counting down. And so 38, 37, 36, 35, 34. I believe it started with 52. So there is one of them a week. And then at the end of the year, then we launch into Final Crisis. So yeah, the idea was that this was all going to lead into the big events of Final Crisis, which were going to be yet another huge crossover event, which was going to reset continuity again. Except it turns out that Countdown did not lead into Final Crisis because the writers of Final Crisis had already started writing the story before Countdown was finished, and the two teams did not coordinate at all, or the editors failed to coordinate between the two storylines. This was something that, again, comic book fans were upset about at the time, because people were buying and reading these Countdown issues, anticipating that this was all going to lead into the big Final Crisis, and then it turns out that it didn't lead anywhere, and a lot of these events got contradicted by the events of Final Crisis, and it turns out that maybe this wasn't even, it was retconned out of continuity, or I don't know. In fact, I don't even really know what the specific events were that were contradicted in Final Crisis. I just know that it was something people were upset about at the time. But I am anticipating myself, because this is only volume 2. It only goes up to, I think, issue 26. And so the lead into Final Crisis is still a ways off here. But anyways, Countdown. So Countdown, we've reestablished the DC multiverse at this point. There are 52 different universes. And we have 6 different storylines being told in Countdown. Jimmy Olsen, Karate Kid, Holly Robinson and Harley Quinn, Donna Troy and Jason Todd, Pied Piper and the Trickster, and Mary Marvel. So each issue of Countdown is juggling these 6 storylines, which means each storyline only gets a couple pages in Countdown, which has the potential to create a convoluted feel or create pacing problems. But for my money, it's handled well. Each individual story neither feels rushed nor dragged out. It only gets a couple of pages per issue, but those couple of pages advance the story the way it needs to be advanced in each issue. There are a couple of exceptions. There's also a few instances where it feels like pages are missing, where we pick up the storyline in the middle of a battle which was not set up in the previous issue, and I assume maybe pages are missing. Maybe they had pages that they weren't able to fit in, and so they just cut out part of the story. But, I guess there's an assumption that the reader can just kind of piece together what has happened in between issues. And, as the reader, you do piece together what has happened in between issues. So it works out well for the most part. The characters that they are following are interesting as well, in that these are not the top level DC characters, right? It's not Superman, Batman, and Wonder Woman. It's characters like Harley Quinn or Donna Troy, Jason Todd, Jimmy Olsen, the Karate Kid, who's prior to the series, I never heard of him, but he's a minor character from the Legion of Superheroes. According to Wikipedia, he was first introduced in the 1960s. Mary Marvel, the little sister of Captain Marvel originally from Fawcett Comics, but DC bought them up in the 1970s, etc. Each of these characters has a long history and backstory, which I don't have time to get into in this review, but it's interesting to see that some of these minor characters are spotlighted here. As much as mid-2000s DC gets a fair amount of flack for some of their outrageous storylines, I do feel like the company was mostly being run by fellow nerds at this time, who appreciated the minor comic book characters and appreciated their long history and liked to play along with that. I'm not sure DC Comics is still doing that. Although, I've completely lost track of what DC Comics is currently doing. I feel like, I don't know, what's your impression? I feel like around the time of Countdown, in 2007, as much as comic book fans were complaining about what DC was doing, they were talking about it. And I don't see anyone actively talking about the current DC continuity in the way that discussion used to exist. But it could just be I'm following the wrong blogs now, or, it could have, the discourse could have moved to other places and I haven't followed it. I don't know. What's your impression? Does DC Comics still embrace some of its minor characters? Does this discussion about fans still exist in the way it used to? Or have fans just become completely disillusioned and left the comic books? I don't know. While I'm on the topic of characters who get spotlighted, this is maybe as good a time as any to point out that this cover is completely misleading. They do have the Karate Kid spotlighted here. He's one of 6 characters or 6 storylines that's going on through the Countdown, so the Karate Kid is fair enough. But these other characters around him are not prominent parts of the story. And in fact, like this character like Red Arrow he's barely in the story. He's just in the background in a couple scenes. So the cover is misleading. But once we get into it, we get everyone's story. Now, I'm not going to have time to talk about all the stuff in here. So I'm going to have to Yeah, the camera I'm using will automatically shut down after 30 minutes. Even if it didn't automatically shut down after 30 minutes, to really get into all the plot that's going on in here, I'd probably need hours to talk about it. So I'll try and just talk about this in generalities. Like I said before, the pacing of this is okay. For all its faults, it's very readable. The dialogue, for my money, gets a little bit cheesy at times. The quips that the characters trade back and forth are kind of groaners, but it's readable. It is readable. You know, I know this got a lot of flack when it came out, but it holds your attention while you're reading it. So, okay. Can't talk about everything, but let's talk about some of the things. So there is Mary Marvel. So Mary Marvel, at this point in continuity, is borrowing her powers from Black Adam for reasons I don't remember. I think she used to get her powers from Captain Marvel, but Captain Marvel has now become the Wizard Shazam, so that's been disrupted. And I remember some internet discussion about how the powers of Black Adam were corrupting Mary Marvel. Although that's not in these issues. In these issues, Eclipso is somehow corrupting Mary Marvel for reasons that I don't fully understand. So Mary Marvel is portrayed in these issues as just going crazy with the power and becoming more and more evil as it goes on, in a way that got a lot of comic book fans upset, because it was completely anathema to the character of Mary Marvel, who had always been portrayed as very innocent in comic books. Sorry, I'm flipping randomly. Let me choose a page and stay on it. I don't know. Because it's very clear in these issues that Mary Marvel is being corrupted by outside sources, I think you can kind of go along with this as a storyline. Depending on how much power you attribute to the outside sources or Mary Marvel's ability to fight it, etc. The other thing that I remember fans complaining about at the time is that Mary Marvel was portrayed in a little bit of a sexualized way, despite the fact that the character in universe continuity is not 18 yet. I didn't notice it so much reading these issues. She's got a short skirt in these, and occasionally you can see the tights beneath the skirt. But, here's a good example of that. It's a comic. Woman characters are routinely portrayed sexualized in these comics. Now, whether or not that's a good thing or not, we can have a long discussion about, but it's an established thing at the very least. That's Mary Marvel. We also have the Karate Kid. I already mentioned him. He was a minor character from the Legion of Superheroes dating back to the 1960s who gets a spotlight here. Because he's from the Legion of Superheroes, he's from the future. He's picked up some sort of futuristic disease, and he's come back in time to try and get a cure for that disease. And something about having gone back in time is creating a crisis in the multiverse. All of these storylines are supposedly creating a crisis in the multiverse, which is going to lead into Final Crisis. There's also the Trickster and Pied Piper, two minor villains from the Flash series, who I guess at this point in continuity have reformed, but who are in trouble because people think that they killed the younger Flash, Bart Allen. And so they are on the run essentially from everybody now, superheroes as well as supervillains. The Pied Piper has been made as a gay character, and there are numerous references throughout this to gay stereotypes or his sexuality, which I mentioned because it's another thing I remember fans complaining about at the time. Not so much, I mean, the original character was a very old character who I believe was not gay, but this being the 2000s, they're trying to get representation into comics. I don't think anyone was upset about the idea of representation itself, but I think people felt like it was a little bit ham-fisted the way it was done. So here's an example of the dialogue. He says, "I realize you people can't miss a wedding or a party, but this is insanely stupid." You people? Relax, Nancy. Grab your complimentary candied almonds and let's get the hell out of here. So, yeah. That's something people I remember were complaining about at the time. Oh, speaking of which, while I'm over here, there's... Yeah, this is one of those things where there's a battle which seems to have occurred between issues. So the Pied Piper and Trickster are going over to warn the heroes about a supervillain attack which is planned for Green Arrow and Black Canary's wedding. And then we just skip, and that attack is already going on, and you're just like, well, what happened to the wedding? Doesn't the wedding get more of a build-up than this? Etc. But I strongly suspect that that wedding was dealt with in another issue. Which is, yeah, another difficulty with reading these books in collected editions is because when these were coming out in the newsstand or the comic book store, there were all sorts of tie-in issues that you needed to read to catch the full story, which is probably not appreciated collected here. Or am I wrong? Was the wedding of Green Arrow and Black Canary just skipped over? Somebody let me know what was going on in comics at this time. And then you have Jimmy Olsen. So Jimmy Olsen, the longtime side character from the Superman comics, has acquired a whole bunch of superpowers which he doesn't even know about and can't control. I think I read somewhere at the time that this was a nod to all the different superpowers that Jimmy Olsen had acquired at one point or another over the character's history. So it was a common gag, I believe, in Superman comics for Jimmy Olsen to acquire this unexplained power, and then Superman would have to deal with the situation. Now, that has all been erased from continuity because DC has reset their continuity several times. But I believe that what's supposed to be happening here is because of some sort of crisis in the multiverse, all these powers that have been in previous continuities with Jimmy Olsen are all now getting him at once. So he is trying to control his powers, figure out what to do with his powers. He goes into Cadmus, where he runs into the Newsboy Legion in the sewers. I've talked about in previous reviews that I like the Newsboy Legion. I think it's interesting how DC, at this period in their continuity, was simultaneously experimenting with more serious storylines, at the same time reaching back into their history to use a lot of very cartoonish characters from their past. I don't know. There are positives and negatives to that. I think it's kind of interesting. But, you know, the flip side of that is, I guess, what's going on with Mary Marvel, where we have a character who had previously been very innocent, used in these storylines that are getting fans upset. Okay, we also, while all this is going on, we have a storyline where there's a bunch of characters going through the multiverse looking for Ray Palmer, the Atom, who has disappeared into the multiverse, and his being lost in the multiverse is the key to something about the multiverse. And these characters include Jason Todd, who himself is supposed to be dead. Jason Todd is the infamous Robin who was killed off in the Batman Death in the Family issue. But he was brought back, I believe, due to, what was the explanation? Superboy Prime punching the walls of the multiverse and creating distortions. So, again, I don't understand this 100%, but the monitors are keeping their eyes on Jason Todd because his very existence is some sort of an affront to the established continuity. Donna Troy is also a character who's got some convoluted origins. Again, I don't understand the whole thing, but she's also part of this. And I guess these other the new Green Lantern, Kyle Rayner, apparently is part of that as well. So they've got one of the monitors. An old DC continuity. In the original Crisis, I believe there was only one monitor. But with the establishment of 52 multiverses now, we've got, I believe, 52 monitors. And the monitors have meetings talking about what to do as what does it say? The source wall is becoming degraded. And this is in part because of characters jumping back and forth between the different multiverses, degrading the source wall. Oh, as well as the Monarch, who is a long-established DC villain who is also going through the multiverses trying to establish an army to take over the universe. Like I said, there's a lot going on here. And I haven't even talked about Holly Robinson and Harley Quinn, and what was the other one? I talked about most of it. And of course, a lot of this relates to all sorts of previously established DC continuity, which, of course, nerds really like. So here is like the Crime Syndicate, which is comic book nerds will know that this is from Earth 3, from the old DC multiverse before Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1986. There's some, I don't know what you would call this, maybe some fourth wall breaking. So Jason Todd says, "Great. Someone just hit me with a crowbar now." So this is a reference to the way the original Jason Todd died, getting hit with a crowbar by the Joker. He's now using it as a punchline. And then we have this, ho, that's a cue if I ever heard one. And then here comes the Jokester, who's like the Joker, but because this is Earth 3, the usual villains are heroes and the heroes are villains. So he comes in and fights the Crime Syndicate. But the point being here, this is a reference to continuity that the readers should catch, but the in-universe characters should not catch, right? So the fact that the Jokester recognizes hit with a crowbar as a cue for him to appear would indicate that the Jokester knows the history about Jason Todd being killed by a crowbar in another universe, in another continuity, which he shouldn't know, unless I'm missing something. But there are a few references like that. There's a few jokes which work on the meta level, but I don't think work on the in-universe level. I don't know. Okay, I'm going to have to wrap it up. Like I said, there's a whole lot more to talk about here, but, I've got a 30-minute limit on this camera, and it's just as well because we don't want to be here all day anyways, right? So one of these days, I may try and find all these books in the library, and I may try and work through my way through this whole storyline, but